I think that AP focuses so much on building hype around their brand and creating a culture around their brand and making it so hard to buy their stuff that it drives me crazy. Also, I just bought a new AP.
This is Open Work, a look inside the watch industry, a podcast from Collective Horology. I'm Gabe Riley, co-founder of Collective.
And I'm Asher Rapkin, co-founder of Collective. Collective Horology is an independent watch retailer based in Southern California, and we carry a wide range of independent brands, including Chapek, Ming, and Fears. To learn more about us and check out our available inventory, visit collectivehorology.com. Hey, Gabe. We have some news.
We do have some news. Before we get into today's topic, probably two things we want to cover. The first is Open House. Asher, what is Open House?
Last year, we started something that we've wanted to do for a long time, which is an event here in Los Angeles focused entirely on independent watches. We know from talking to clients and friends how much people want to be able to see the full line from a lot of the brands that we work with, as well as some that we don't. And it's very, very difficult, especially with limited production companies like we work with, to be able to do that. So with that in mind, we created Open House last year, and we're bringing it back even bigger this year. Open House is a one-day event on Saturday, June 7th in Hollywood, California. The event is going to feature between 6 to 10 brands. You can learn all about that on the website that we'll share with you shortly. It's free. You'll be able to go hands-on with the full lines from all of those brands, meet representatives from those brands, and of course, connect with other collectors. It is an awesome, fun day. We had a blast doing it last year, and it's something that we are committed to doing moving forward. So if you're a listener, if you're in the LA area, if you're in California, or even if you're not and you want to come in, we would absolutely love to see you. RSVPs are required, but there's no cost for entry. Gabe, how does somebody RSVP?
Cool. Yeah. If you want to learn more and if you want to RSVP, you can just go to collectivehorology.com/open house. And I think let's tell people a couple of the brands that are already signed up and will be there. So confirmed to be there this year, and this is just an initial list, are Chapek, Garrick, Ming, Sartori Biard, Singer Reimagined, and Speak Marine. Mm-hmm. We will have additional brands and some additional programming that we're going to be announcing in the weeks ahead. So of course, we'll do that on the podcast Saturday, June 7th in the Hollywood neighborhood of Los Angeles. And if you want to learn more or attend, like Asher said, RSVPs are required. So go to collectivehorology.com/open house. Next up, tariffs. We have gotten
very Archie luxury of you.
Sure. Yeah, I guess so. We've gotten a lot of people reaching out, which makes sense, about tariffs and wanting it to be something that we cover here on Open Work, since, of course, this is a podcast about the watch industry. And we have covered a number of topical and breaking topics on the podcast. The challenge for us with tariffs has been, it's not just a breaking story, but it's something that is evolving and changing very quickly. And for a bi-weekly podcast, as soon as we record and publish something, it's going to change again. So we're not, at least now, going to cover the news of tariffs. And there's been plenty of other ink spilled on it and plenty of discussion on it anyway. But I do think it is worth noting that when it comes to the subject of tariffs, we've seen both in the watch community, so this would be in collector circles and groups and chats and things like that, but also in watch media itself, a lot of misunderstanding and in some cases misinformation of tariffs, how they work, and what the implications are, not just for watch brands and importers, retailers, things like that, but for the end customer as well. So I think we do want to point people toward a couple of good sources of information where you can find accurate, reliable, and insightful information about tariffs and their impact specifically on the watch industry. So two things I would point people toward, and Asher, tell me if there's anything else you've seen that's helpful on this topic, would first and foremost be Hodinkee. So a couple of months ago, Hodinkee brought in Andy Hoffman, who is a journalist covering the business of watches. Previous to Hodinkee, he'd been at Bloomberg, I think for over a decade, covering a number of industries in Switzerland, including watches. So this is someone who knows what they're talking about and has a ton of editorial and journalistic credibility and has reported on this quite well at Hodinkee. So he's done a number of articles about tariffs and their implications for the industry. They're accurate. They've got interesting interviews with industry executives about this stuff, and certainly worth reading. So we'd point people toward Hodinkee for that stuff. There are a couple of other watch publications that have just gotten basic information about tariffs wrong. So Hodinkee is really the only one we can recommend at this point. And then the other one, which has been really interesting, has been Mark from Long Island Watches, a former guest of this podcast, someone who really inspires us to be transparent in what we do. He has posted a number of videos that specifically get into what are the implications and how exactly do tariffs work for watch retailers in the United States. So he will show you an invoice he's gotten from U.S. Customs and break out how exactly watches are tariffed, what the costs are, and what the considerations have been for him and his business to navigate it. Now, we're not necessarily navigating, and the brands we work with aren't necessarily navigating and thinking about tariffs in exactly the same way. But in terms of the reality of how it works and who's paying for what and all that kind of stuff, like Mark will take you through in quite excruciating detail, which is awesome, how that all works.
Perfect. The only thing I would add to that, if you're anything like me, when things like this happen, you want to look at them in a larger perspective as well and understand not just the mechanics of how things like this work, but also just the overall economic theory and some of the impact of it. So I spoke to a good friend of mine who is a working economist, and one thing that he recommended, which I'm enjoying reading and I think is useful, would be some of the work of Robert Heilbroner. That's Heilbroner. He's an American economist, or was an American economist. And the two books that were recommended to me are The Worldly Philosophers and Economics Explained. And this has been really helpful for me as I think about this not only as a small business owner and looking at just the day-to-day, but also just trying to understand the dynamics of global economics, which for a humble theater major is sometimes a bit much to handle. So I'm sure this topic will be revisited at some point, but our one request and ask of you is, if you're interested in this topic, focus on the places where there's trusted facts and be active in sharing those with those in your community so that we can all be working from one center of truth.
Yeah. And this is what happens in turbulent times. There's misinformation and misunderstanding, not because of any bad intention, but I do think it's important for us to direct people to the things we've seen that are accurate in their reporting. So that's tariffs. Let's talk about our main topic today. So gosh, it's now, speaking of things that are traditions at Collective like Open House, one thing that has become a tradition has been our listener survey. So for those of you who listen to the podcast and are on the Collective list, back in February, we asked you to participate in a survey to understand your thoughts about the watch industry and all things watches. And this is the second time we've done it. The first time we did this was back in the summer of 2024. And actually, the timing is interesting. That was right before Geneva Watch Days. This was right before Watches and Wonders. And we time it that way for two reasons. One, it's nice to every 6 months have a sense of, where your heads are at, how people are thinking about the watch industry and watches. But two, these are opportunities for us to go to the brands with whom we work in Geneva when we meet with them at those two industry events and share your feedback. We think it's really important to go to Geneva, not just to hear the brands and see their novelties, but also to advocate not just for our business, but for enthusiasts and for collectors, because the industry needs to hear your feedback. And so we did that at Geneva Watch Days. We did that again at Watches and Wonders. And today we're going to share with you guys the results of that survey, and more than the results themselves, the key themes, what we're hearing, and really some interesting contradictions that came up from the data that I think are worth talking about and thinking about. For all of this information, we're going to have a detailed blog post at collectivehorology.com/blog, which gets into all of the data, all the facts and figures, and all the details. So if you're hearing something that we cover in terms of a topic or numbers or whatever, and you're looking for more, or you want to understand more or see this all together, it's at collectivehorology.com/blog. But Asher, you are the mastermind behind this survey, which is a huge compliment because this has been eye-opening for us. And I think maybe a place to start is just generally with broad themes, and in particular, we talked about this on our last podcast covering this back in the summer. What has changed since the summer of 2024 in terms of the big things we're hearing from collectors?
Well, the good news, I don't know if it's good news, but like some of the interesting news is that some things haven't actually changed that much and some things have. So there's really two buckets that I would put that in. There's the enthusiasm bucket, and then there is a pivot, which I find particularly interesting. So first, let's just start with some methodology and some numbers. I think that's important. The very first survey that we did went out to our existing clients, and I believe we had 91 respondents. Now we had 129 respondents. So we're slowly growing. Our goal is to obviously have a larger pool every single time. But when we ask you about this, and if you took the survey, you'll remember this, there are certain questions that we're going to ask every time. And the reason we do that is putting on our old corporate hat. We want to look at this as what we would call a longitudinal study, snooze. But basically what that means is we want to be able to track certain data points over time. And one of those that we track is around enthusiasm and positivity around outlook. And we saw a couple of interesting things here. The first was there was essentially a statistically insignificant, quote unquote, decrease in enthusiasm. We went from an 8.41 out of 10 average to an 8.14 out of 10 average. That's definitely within the margin of error. And what that basically says is enthusiasm in the watch industry remains incredibly strong. And that's essentially the same for the outlook on the watch industry. In June of last year, July of last year, it was around 7.54 out of 10. And this year it's at 7.34 out of 10, which again is within the margin of error. So we're basically within the same range. So we're really happy about that because what it shows is that amongst the people who took the time to respond to this, enthusiasm in the industry is still exceptional. Now, on a second topic, we looked at another trend which came through. And when I say trend, this is what we see through the open-ended questions that we ask throughout the survey. And one major trend, which is very clear and was statistically significant, was that overwhelmingly, people are moving away from mainstream brands and towards indies and their interests. But what's fascinating about that is that the reasons that they're doing that vary pretty significantly. And they fall into a couple of categories. One of them is this feeling of a perceived lack of creativity from mainstream brands. Another is a clear voiced concern about the difficulty of acquisition from mainstream brands. And then the third, and this is something that we've seen from the previous survey, was also a constant increase in price, but that's caveated with a perception that there's no increase in quality or value. And we're going to come back to that because it's a really interesting thing that we're seeing around what people are willing to pay for versus where they find frustration points. And then finally, and this sort of is a little bit of a underpinning to that, is that we do hear people talking a lot about, and we're going to come back to this because there's some interesting insight around this. They complain about limitation, scarcity, hype. These are direct quotes specifically from the survey. But their purchase behavior often tells a different story. So we're going to come back to that because that's a kind of interesting analysis that we did on the results here, which we hadn't done in the first one, that I think folks are going to find particularly interesting.
Yeah, that stood out like a sore thumb. And we're going to talk about kind of three key areas today, and then a fourth, which are contradictions. And when we saw that discrepancy in terms of like, we're hearing a lot of, understandably so, and we've been vocal about this stuff, we've heard a lot of bad and negative sentiment around scarcity and hype and limitation, contrasted with the fact that people tend to be telling us they're buying things that are scarce, limited, and hyped. That prompted us to say, what other contradictions might be in this data? And so we did a whole query and looked at what are some of the contradictions between what people are telling us and how they actually behave. And so that's a whole section we'll chat about today. But before we get into those contradictions, there are sort of three key areas we wanted to cover. One is look a little bit more at what is overall industry sentiment, like what are collectors telling us that they feel about the industry as a whole. It's generally still positive, but some interesting learnings and updates there. Two, what are their expectations of brand? So what are people telling us that they want? We'll chat a little bit about that. Then we'll look at purchase drivers. So what are people telling us are actually motivating them to buy, which can sometimes be a little bit different than how they're feeling or what their expectations might be. And then finally, we'll get into those. We'll probably have most of the discussion around those contradictions that we found in the data, which were really kind of eye-opening. And I think pose some interesting questions for all of us. So if you will, Asher, why don't we start with overall sentiment and how people are feeling generally about the industry?
Yeah, so there's three categories there, and some of these are fun to talk about just in terms of the direct feedback that we've gotten. So one of them is a deeper dive into this falling affection for large brands. And when we talk about large brands, what we're really referring to here are the holding company brands. So these are LVMH, Richemont, Swatch Group, and then I think we can fairly put Rolex and Patek in there too, even though they are, of course, technically independent, but by size and scope, they certainly qualify. There's a second category in there around pricing, and then a third around customer experience. And of course, the affection or disaffection, as it were, or lack of affection, as it were, for big brands is reflected across those other two categories. And I'm going to share some direct quotes here too. And for those who submitted the survey, as you know, these are anonymized. So we don't know who said this. We just know that a specific respondent said it, and it's attached to a specific numerical response. We know it's a specific individual. We just don't know who. Okay. So interestingly, there are more and more vocal frustrations when we track from 2024 to 2025 against a couple of brands. I'm going to pause before I go any further. I'm just going to say, we're reporting out data. These are not reflective of like our personal opinions of these brands, or, and this isn't anything that we're doing in an attempt to put them in a negative light. We're simply reporting out the data.
Yeah. I do think it's also worth noting that we are an independent watch retailer. A lot of the topics on this podcast have to do with independent watches. A lot of our customers and listeners are interested in independent watches. And certainly there may be some bias in the data towards independence or an affinity toward independent brands, and maybe less so toward large brands. And so I want to acknowledge that, and we fully get it. But the data is what it is. And also, I think some of those verbatims, those quotes you'll share will shine some light on this.
Yeah, and I'm pulling those verbatims too while we go through here. So, all right, so diving in, there was a statistically notable increase in frustration and negative sentiment towards a handful of brands. And those were Patek Philippe, Vacheron Constantin, Rolex Omega, and Grand Seiko in particular. I pulled the top.
Grand Seiko.
Huh.
The tide is turning.
Yeah, I'll pull some data on that one, and we can look into it. But there was, and then in 2025, when I look at specifically, I cut that data even further. And I was like, well, okay, in 2025, who is really at the tip of that? So not just year over year change, but just like pure negative sentiment. And it wasn't the same group, interestingly. It was A. Lange & Söhne, Audemars Piguet, Omega, IWC, JLC, and Rolex. These had the most negative feedback around them. And that feedback really bucketed into those other two areas around pricing and customer experience. So I'm going to read just a couple of things here. And some of these I think are going to be familiar. And some of these I think, in fairness, probably carry a little bit more weight than others, but they're still an honest assessment. So, quote, I wanted an Odysseus. That's an A. Lange & Söhne. So I wanted an A. Lange & Söhne Odysseus. Quote, and the boutique experience was awful. I don't think I will ever bother going to the secondary market to get one at this point. The arrogance about me having to prove myself to be one of their clients was astonishing. Another one on Lange. There's just too many games to purchase their in-demand watches, and it ties me into buying from only one brand. Who does that? ? Look, I think this is a thread that we see too. To our friends at Lange, I know sometimes it's not fun to hear that. But there's basically three things that we're seeing thematically across these, which is this perception of bundling, this perception of being judged worthy of being able to buy a watch, and this perception that in order to acquire something like this, you have to jump through some form of hoop to do it.
Yeah. I want to just point out something about the bundling and the Lange quotes in particular. And I know this came up last time we did this survey and reported it out with AP. Same thing. Bundling. This is a behavior that for years ADs have been derided for. Yep. And I know I've talked about this before. And the sentiment generally in the collector community has been something like, man, if the brands only knew the way the dealers were treating their customers, they would be appalled. And I've said this before, but it's the brands who set these conditions, A and B, in some cases.
When you say set these conditions, you mean set the market condition. You don't mean like set a rule about bundling.
I don't set the market conditions. And we've talked about that in the case of Rolex and Patek Philippe, who primarily work with third-party retailers. In this case, we're talking about a brand that essentially has pulled retailers and retails directly. So most people who are trying to buy in a Lange & Söhne are doing so from a company-owned and operated boutique and are being treated this way by people who are employees of the brand and of Richemont. So this is bundling is a behavior that is not just perpetrated by unscrupulous dealers. This is a behavior that's now being perpetrated by a brand itself.
Yeah, what I find interesting in here too, and I'm going to read a quote about Patek Philippe because I think it demonstrates something which is fascinating, which is how much power the perception of a CEO can have on a brand. So, for example, even though there's some negative intent or negative commentary on IWC in the survey, it's almost entirely focused around price. People feel like IWC's pricing has gotten high.
Not that they walked into a boutique and were treated poorly.
In fact, for IWC, it was all entirely around price. Yeah. But one thing that I think is interesting about IWC is that there's a lot of positive sentiment towards Chris Granger-Hare, who is an incredibly hardworking and effusive and an available CEO.
And to a person at IWC, we can say they're wonderful people.
Truly. Yeah, absolutely. But the reason I bring Chris up is as a counterpoint to the commentary that we're seeing here with Patek. And again, I'm reading a direct quote. Making a Nautilus clone, the Cubitus, when everyone just wants the original steel Nautilus is ridiculous. Its CEO, so Patek Philippe CEO, is an elitist prig who looks down on potential clients. End quote. To have that perception in the market, whether it's true or it isn't, and I've never met Terry Stern, so I have no idea, is not a good thing. And there's a second point around Patek, which is another quote here. Patek seems to create watches for profit and not for value. So if we align that back to the earlier point, which is that people feel that prices are too high because they are not delivering against value or against improvements that the client feels justifies the price, a frustration comes from that. And if you mix that with an additional frustration that you feel that the human representation of the brand, so in many cases the CEO, does not exemplify the experience, the relationship, and the connection that an individual wants with that brand, there's a challenge there. And look, obviously we're biased who sell independent watches, and arguably you could say we've surveyed independent watch buyers, so there's probably an inherent bias in there too.
Yeah.
But I think that you do see a difference there in terms of why somebody might be pulled towards an independent, because of course independents are, if nothing else, driven largely by personality. You know, if you want a Sartori Biard, you're very excited about Armand. You know, if you want a Chapek, you're probably following Chapek in My Eyes on Instagram and interested in what Xavier de Roquemorel has to say, and so on and so forth. And that is a blind spot that is growing, I think, for some of these CEOs, because when we see in the news, a lot of them are very focused on like a lot of the news of like a new CEO at brand X or a new CEO at brand Y. And those CEOs are understandably and frankly, rightly so, very focused on the business. But I think there's a missed opportunity in some cases about them really putting a face on some of these brands and giving some of these clients something to feel like they're interacting with humans, not necessarily just a large corporation. And I mean, even Apple succeeds at that. Like, many people know that Tim Cook is the CEO of Apple, and you can like Tim, you can not like Tim, like whatever, but Tim has a very particular way of going about his business and talking about his company, and that has an impact on the perception
for that
of it.
reason. Yeah.
Correct.
And look, we're talking about the perceptions of watch enthusiasts, and we're talking about the implications of some of those behaviors, or you're talking about whether it's bundling or saying what seem to be condescending things in the media to watch enthusiasts. But in many ways, watch enthusiasts are the core of these brands' businesses and will be customers, hopefully, for these brands through thick and thin. They're driven less by, well, we'll talk about it, but generally they're driven less by trends than the more average casual luxury buyer. So it's probably not a great idea to alienate any customer, particularly someone who's an enthusiast. So I think that's a good place to start with the industry sentiment. It's like we're seeing a decline in sort of love for big brands, and really underpinning that are perceptions about pricing not delivering value, and then poor customer experience.
Yeah. And I want to point out again, Lang & Söhne, Patek Philippe, these are some of the brands that were highlighted here. So I want to just thank them for being tribute on this page. We could have done the same to other brands too, but I brought up those quotes in particular to demonstrate the overall trend. So respect to them. We'll try not to pick on them in other categories.
All right, yeah. Maybe pick some others for the next one. So speaking of those sentiments and those feelings, particularly around customer experience, next topic we want to talk about here are collector expectations. So what people are telling us they want from watch brands and the watch industry.
Yeah.
So we know what they don't like.
Let's talk about what they want.
What do they want?
Yeah, so this is really, really cool. Okay, so if you again break this down into three categories, it's really category 1 is around innovation, design, and sizing. Category 2 is around access, and category 3 is around craftsmanship. So when we look at innovation and design, there was a material move. So there was like an increase in overall sentiment around clients looking for new designs, specifically being attracted to creative dials and looking for innovative technology. Now, this really speaks to me as a collector, so I'm very excited about this, but it also reflects a lot of what we're seeing out in the market. When we look at a brand like Burneron, like boom, bullseye, right in the middle of all of this, right? Movement design specifically for an unusual case with a very particular design, exploring new dial materials and the rest, like 100%, 100%, 100%.
So when you say technology, what would be examples of like people looking for technology? The other things like design and size and things like that.
Yeah, I think people are like excited about like technical innovation. So what I mean by that is like, this obviously wasn't mentioned, but it's a good example of it. Was a couple years ago, both Frédéric Constant and Zenith explored new escapement technologies. And that seems to be like something that's very high on people's lists. New movement design. So moving away from like the homogeneity of like recognized calibers, making sure that watches are more accurate, making sure that, so for example, like we saw some reference to like the Lederer triple certified chronometer.
Materials, I'm assuming, could fall in. I'm thinking of like Ming, their use of sapphire, their use of white loom, which we talked about on this podcast.
Yes, these are all good examples of what we're talking about.
Things like that.
Yeah, and by the way, this connects back to the previous point where people are saying, I don't want to pay more for something that doesn't do that. But that also cuts both ways, with clients saying, but I would pay more if you did that, which is, I think, a really important message and a positive one, because if you believe that watchmaking is a creative canvas for technical and artistic expression, guys, like watch industry, have at it. That's what we're hearing people say overwhelmingly.
It's interesting. At Watches and Wonders, Tudor had a couple of novelties, both in the 39 millimeter size. They had that Black Bay Pro with the opaline dial, and then the Black Bay, what was it, the 58?
68?
No, the 58 in 39.
42 or the Black Bay 84.
Now it's all mixed. Exactly. They had the Black Bay 58 with that burgundy dial and bezel. And you know what? Guess which of those two watches costs more? The GMT, the dual time watch, or the time only watch?
I actually don't know. The time only?
The time only watch costs more money. Now, the reason why is it's using a METIS certified movement, whereas the Black Bay Pro is, although it's a more complicated watch with the 2 time zones and the date and all that, it's not a master chronometer. And so we can argue, is there really that value in the movement or that METIS certification? Does it fundamentally make a difference? But what I thought was interesting was it showed an awareness on behalf of Tudor that if they're going to increase the price on something or offer something at a higher price
there has
point,
to be more there.
That there has to be some substance there, which I thought was really interesting and unexpected. And at first I was like, what the heck? How is this possible? But then I'm like, well, actually, they're responding to what the market is saying, which is if you're delivering real value and innovation and something fundamentally new, then we'll pay for it.
Totally. And you know what? Like, I love that because it does speak to a very particular segment of the audience, right? Like, we have clients that are really, really, really focused on accuracy. And that's something that gives them joy from the watch that they own. And, if there are plenty of people out there who are like, yeah, I don't care if it's plus 10 or minus 10, like the finishing on the bridges is what's important to me. And then there are other people out there that are like, plus 10, minus 10. What are you, out of your mind? I want METIS.
But I think it also sets an important precedent, which is if you really prize accuracy, which is something that is very hard to do in this industry. I mean, you talked about that later, triple certified
observatory
chronometer. I mean,
trademark.
You're certainly paying up with that watch for accuracy as you should. And so if it's something you value, you do need to be prepared to pay for it. I think sometimes we see people have very unrealistic expectations of accuracy. So good for Tudor.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so access. This is interesting because this has always been, I think we may have talked about this at some point in a pod or maybe not, but we at Collective have always defined luxury in terms of access. That's what we feel luxury can and should be. It's not the only thing that's luxurious, but it's how we think about it, which is making it easy for people to be able to find the pieces that they want insofar as those can be acquired. And, it's interesting here because there's some things, and it's challenging when I look at some of this because you can't, as somebody who works in the business, dismiss somebody's feelings, even if you know on the back end that some of that isn't intentional. So I'll give you an example. There's an overall frustration with limited availability and difficulty of purchasing desirable models. Let's break that sentence down. Let's just say there's 10 gold bars and 100 people. Those gold bars are desirable. There's 100 people that have the money to buy the gold bars. A certain, 10 of those people are going to get the gold bars and 90 people aren't, but there was only ever 10 gold bars. Now, you could respond to that and say, well, then, the retailer or the brand was foolish. They should have made 100 gold bars. But then that creates an interesting dynamic because now everyone can get them. But the thing that we know as retailers and that anyone who's ever engaged in sales at all is if 100 people say they want something, 100 people aren't going to buy it. So now you're left with additional gold. And if there's additional gold bars sitting in that box, someone's going to say, well, they didn't sell out? Oh, gee, they must not be worth that much anymore. And maybe the price of gold starts to go down because the supply and demand isn't necessarily there. Now, you can make an argument about that being artificial, and in some cases, that's absolutely true. Could Rolex make more Daytonas? Of course they could. Why would Rolex make more Daytonas, though? It doesn't make any sense for them, because the worst thing that could possibly happen would be a watch that has been perhaps one of the most in-demand watches for decades is now available, and therefore the depressed value in the market, or the value in the market is depressed. That's intentional. The unintentional side is a small business, like an independent watch brand, chooses to make 25 pieces of a release.
Because that's what they have the capacity for, or that's the financial risk they're able to accept.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That is not artificial. Now, that watch could be a blockbuster with 400 people lining up for it, or that watch could be financially unsuccessful with nobody lining up for it. And the bottom line there is that there's only one person at the beginning who's on the financial hook for that, and that's the watchmaker. We've talked about this before. So it's a perception that's there, and I don't know how solvable it is because there's a human and collector insight and truth, which is that people want to get what is rare and special. That's why we collect art. That's why we're collectors. But risk exists throughout the pipeline. And if we expect all of the risk to sit on just one component of that pipeline, the collector, the retailer, the distributor, the watchmaker, it falls apart.
Yeah, well, I think there's two things going on here. One, you're right. We should not dismiss the frustration around the idea that the limited availability of watches, difficulty purchasing desirable models, things like that, just kind of sucks.
Yep.
That is legitimate. I think your point here is there's two things going on, right? Sometimes there absolutely is manufactured scarcity.
Yeah.
And we can debate whether that's, it should be that way or not. But
totally.
Frankly, if you want something, you have the means to acquire it, you'd really like to have it, and you can't, that just sucks. It just sucks. So I totally get that. I think the point we would ask for people to have some empathy around is this notion that in a lot of cases, particularly with independent watchmakers, there absolutely is scarcity, but it's generally not manufactured. It's just frankly, it's due to a limitation of resources. There's only so many watchmakers to make things. Supplies are hard to come by. Human capital is hard to come by. And someone has to pony up. Someone has to pay to start the whole project and finance it. And there's a reasonable amount of risk that they can take in doing that. They kind of have to guess before they get started how many people want the thing.
Yeah. And then I think that leads into sort of the other component here, which is around this feeling that people want easier access to new releases. And they define that as, I'd like to wait less time and I don't like paying deposits. And you know what? I get that, because on a personal level, who wants to park money for 12 months or something? Like, I get it. And this is something that we as an AD debate all the time around what is a reasonable deposit. Because if you break down what a deposit is essentially a guarantee to either the manufacturer or the retailer that when that watch comes in, you're going to follow through on the purchase of it. Because of course, along the lines of Asher saying, you know what, I want that watch, then there's people making commitments down the supply chain to make that possible. And then when that doesn't happen, and we hear like the old chestnut of, oh, but it's so popular, I'm sure you'll be able to resell it. Maybe that's true, maybe that isn't. But the commitment must be honored regardless of whether or not the end user ends up buying it. So that's what a deposit is all about. Now, some deposits are sometimes used as financing for a business. Because if you're a small business, that's what Kickstarter kind of is essentially. If you're a really small business and you have no capital and none of it, you're asking for a lot of money up front. And you know what? In that situation, I think it's a bit different, because I understand, because the risk is higher. Like, I get that. You're essentially saying, I like this project so much, I'm going to put my money where my mouth is and I'm going to hope it shows up.
Well, in the case of independent watchmakers, yeah, you're being a patron of them completely. As artists. Yeah.
And by the way, I'm not saying that one of those is bad or the other. I'm just explaining that's why a deposit is there.
Well, there's another reason, which is, in some ways, it's been a response to the notion that like brands will often produce something, drop it, and it sells out immediately. And then there are people who are like, man, I wish I could have gotten it. One of the reasons a lot of brands have moved to a pre-order model is they've said, okay, the last project we did, I'm making this up. We made 100 watches, it sold out immediately. Hundreds or maybe thousands of people then said, man, I wish I could have had one. Clearly, like I said, our ability to finance this far outweighed what the demand was. And man, if we could have produced more, if we had known the response was going to be so strong, we would have.
Yep.
So then what the brand does is says, all right, next time we want to come up with a system where everyone who wants one can get one. And so the way we're going to do that is we're going to open an order window for pre-orders. And we're going to say, all right, we're not going to limit this to 100 watches this time. We're going to make one watch for everyone who wants one. But here's the thing. You got to sort of make a deposit or pay up front. We'll collect the payment. We'll have it open for a certain amount of time. And then we'll close the window and we'll produce everyone's watches. And everyone who said they will want one will have one. Problem solved. However, that of course leads to this frustration of like, I'm tired of putting down money for pre-orders and deposits, which I totally get. So what I would love to hear from folks, and it's a valid concern. We're certainly explaining what's going on in the industry side behind it, but I get the concern totally.
Me too.
I would love to hear from folks, like genuinely, like I'm curious to hear, because it's part of our business too. Like what would be some models that would be better, that would ensure brands can try to produce as many watches as people want, but also, not push it maybe so far on deposits and wait times and things like that.
And I would add to that, where does the accountability sit there? Because if we're going to figure out ways for brands or retailers to be able to make commitments, then that means that the commitments that come from the client also need to be ironclad. And the deposit structure has been the most effective way of doing that. But super excited and open to hearing other ideas, because obviously the goal here is to make sure that if you are in love with a watch, that you can get it.
Yeah.
And figuring out the right path to do that in a way that makes it work for everybody is super critical.
So that's on the financing of making stuff. What about the making stuff itself? Craftsmanship?
So this is the last point in this category before we move on. And I think this is actually really cool, because this also speaks to my heart. And Gabe has heard me talk about this. In fact, I think we mentioned it in the last pod. The complete idea thing, the idea of a watch being, and again, I'll go back to Burner On because it's just such a good example of this, is something that people want. They want to make sure that the movement, the design, and the overall concept of the watch are fully executed throughout the entirety of the watch, and that you're not, that they aren't just buying like a nice dial in a unremarkable case, or like incredible handwork on the hands with an unremarkable dial. Like the whole thing has to work together.
Well, it's not just about like finishing and
no, but it's about all of these elements coming together to serve a greater idea.
Yeah, I think you talked about, you were interviewed by the folks at Denison about their watches at Watches and Wonders, and you said and those are watches that cost several $100s, not several $1,000s or tens of thousands of dollars. And you talked about that being a complete thought watch with a quartz movement inside, and that quartz was actually the right choice for that because it lends itself to a watch that is straightforward in its design and presentation. There's no seconds hand, and is thin and small and sleek. So a complete thought watch, I think I just want to clarify, it doesn't have to have, multiple dollar signs in front of it. It can be at any price point. But this is what people are looking for. They want a complete, cohesive idea.
Totally. Cool. All right. Well, let's move on to the last two topics here, which are purchase drivers, which I think we can talk about relatively quickly before we get to, I think, the final topic, contradictions.
Okay. So what would, just real quick, we just talked about expectations, what people are telling us they want.
Yep.
Purchase drivers, how is that different? These are the things that are actually compelling people to buy and get them over the hump from theoretically, hey, I'd like to see this, to what am I actually doing? What am I actually buying?
Correct.
Okay.
So this is much less analytical. These are just some numerical readouts. So just some interesting stuff for people to know. So overall, purchase intent is slightly down year over year. So that's 76% of people in 2024, when we surveyed, said they intended to buy a watch that year. 64% said in 2025. But a couple of caveats on that, because it's not telling the full story. The absolute number of purchases to date in 2025 are lower than the absolute number of purchases to date in 2024 when we surveyed. So
because we're earlier in the year.
Exactly. So that I don't know that that's an accurate number. So we could actually see stronger intent throughout the year if we continue on that trajectory. So I would just stick a pin in that number, and we can come back and take a look at it in the second survey we're going to do over the summer. But here's what's
one other thing I wondered just about that lower number. It was the timing for which
it was right before Watches and Wonders,
which is right before Watches and Wonders. And if we had a dime, and this is okay, and it makes sense, we were excited for Watches and Wonders too. But if we had a dime for the number of times people told us, I don't know what I'm going to do right now, I'm waiting to see what comes out at Watches and Wonders, well, we would be very, very wealthy. So it makes sense that this is a moment in time during the year when people are taking a breather and a wait and see approach. So we'll see this summer if the trend reverses.
So there's two more just quantitative things one quantitative and one qualitative thing I want to point out. So quantitatively, this is just an interesting thing. Purchase intent has grown the most from 2024 to 2025 in two price brackets, and that's the $5,000 to $10,000 price bracket and the $25,000 plus price bracket. And that's significantly more than the other brackets.
Okay, so just looking at it the opposite way, where is it down?
It's down aggressively in the sub $5,000 and the sort of, and arguably what I think is one of the hardest price brackets to be competitive in, period, which is the 10 to 20K bracket.
Got it.
And if you think about it, like the 10 to 20K bracket, other than like the sub $5,000 or sub $1,000 brackets, are some of the most crowded brackets out there. And if you've got $15,000 spent on a watch, boy, do you have a lot of choices.
That's true. Same would be true for under $5,000.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm saying. So those price brackets are so competitive, and it's almost as hard to choose a watch for $1,000 as it is for $15,000. When you get to $50,000 or $75,000 or $100,000, like that's rarefied air, and the decisions are much more specific. So which actually aligns with what we're seeing in terms of purchase motivation. So this makes sense when we look at those two price brackets. What people are saying is, in 2024, a majority of people were motivated by a special occasion, or they found a grail. These are quotes, a quote, good deal or media influence. In 2025.
Wait, so people actually, how did you get to the media influence thing? People are actually saying, I
read this in Fratello, or I read this in Hodinkee, and that made me want to buy it. So that's what I mean by media influence. In 2025, those are still there, though down a little bit. But one thing, like thematically, so people didn't say this exactly, but I'm going to categorize this, having read through all the responses, are strategically selected pieces, which makes sense if you see an increase in the $25,000 bracket, because I would hope that if you're buying a watch over 25 grand, it is something that you're strategically selecting. It's really important. It's a lot of money. So that really aligns well there, and kind of makes sense as well for the 5 to 10K bracket. Because again, 5 to 10K from an absolute value standpoint is a lot of money. And I think, 5 to 10K and 25K plus makes sense for being strategic, because if you're moving from one category to another, that's how I'm interpreting the data.
Interesting.
Like if you're a sub $5,000 watch buyer and you're deciding, okay, like there's something I'm really wanted, it's time for me to do it, I'm going to do it. That is a strategically selected piece that might be 8 or 9K. Right? Same deal if you've been collecting at the sort of like 13, 15, 17K level and you're like, okay, it's time to make that move. I'm going to go for it. Yeah, you're going to be strategic about your 25K plus purchase.
Well, it also jibes, I know this is a bigger theme you talked about at the beginning, with everything we're hearing, which is, I'm just going to sort of summarize it as like people are just becoming more, not picky, but sort of, and not even selective, but more discerning overall. So if you think about what we heard about the way they want to be treated by a brand, if you think about pricing, what they're telling us is it's not just about price increases, it's about making sure there's value in what I'm paying for.
Mm-hmm.
If it's in what we heard about expectations, I want brands to deliver these sort of fully thought out watches. I want brands to deliver, value, quality, design, innovation. It tells us, I think, more and more the story here is the market and enthusiasts, and this is good, are becoming more discerning in what they're expecting, which is great.
And one final point on this, we talked a little bit earlier around people complaining around waitlist and bundling, but that was brand related, not necessarily price related. And one thing that we're seeing when we cut the data specifically around pricing is further evidence that people are excited and willing to pay more if they feel that the price is fair and they're getting that value. So we're seeing that value and fairness trend being a through line through purchase intent, brand perception, and overall vibes. This is consistent when you cut that data across those different topic areas, which I find particularly interesting. Okay, so let's bring this home by talking about collector contradictions. Now,
this is the most interesting thing I think that came out of this survey.
and this is again, like this is objective, pulled from the data, and the way we analyzed it was to look for these contradictory statements. And I'll preface by saying, before I go into this, like we all have contradictions in our life, and we all do things, or feel one thing and do another. This happens all the time. And
there is no judgment on this at all. This is not just about watches, but you're right. This is the human condition.
It's the human condition.
Writ large, but it's interesting.
It is interesting. And these are conversations, like I had an argument with my wife about this like last night, about like what I say versus what I do. So, this is the reality. But with that, let's dive in. There are 3 core contradictions that were reported, or that came through this survey. The first is around pricing and exclusivity. The second is around risk. And the third is around hype.
Good old hype.
So let's start with pricing and exclusivity. So many of the people who took the survey criticized rising watch prices. They said that luxury brands were charging too much without offering corresponding improvement in quality. We discussed that, right? Second thing they've said, and this is interesting, is, however, these same respondents. So these are, remember I said that there were individual numbers attached to each of these respondents? Same respondents also indicated a willingness to pay premium prices for certain watches, especially exclusive or high-end brands. So if, in summary, some buyers complain about inflated pricing, but they're still willing to pay high amounts for the right watch.
Well, this is what we talked about, which is, I think the way you thread that needle is collectors are becoming more discerning.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, look, again, this is just a fact. It's what we're seeing.
But I think it's an important message to us and to the brands, which is, if you're raising pricing, you had better offer something compelling.
Yep.
And I think it's easy to look at the survey data that we get now the second time around and say, like, price increases for brands should be off the table. Like, the sentiment about it is just so bad. People have been burned by years of runaway watch prices. However, look, these brands are running businesses. We're running a business. There are certainly cases where something needs to be increased in price because there is demonstrable value there. There's improved quality, or there's new technology, or there's something compelling about it that requires. And in that case, raising a price or having an increased price for something may make sense. So this is why it's important to look at these contradictions, because I think it provides a much more constructive and helpful path forward for all of us than just saying price increases should just be off the table.
Yep. So number 2, risk. So folks that took the survey, as we said earlier, they've expressed frustration with perceived artificial scarcity. They say that brands are creating unnecessary demand by limiting production. We discussed that. They also say at the same time, many of these same respondents are motivated to purchase watches that they perceive as, quote, rare, quote, exclusive, quote, limited edition. And likewise, again, this is self-reported, they lose interest if a watch is readily available. So what's the key contradiction? We see respondents criticizing limited supply, but they want their own purchase to feel special.
I get that one.
Totally.
So, I totally get this one. And this is a little bit of what we're talked about, which is we can't judge every rare, quote unquote, rare or limited watch on the same merits, right? Some watches, there is manufactured scarcity, and it's understanding people are peeved about that. On the other hand, there are watches that are genuinely rare and special, and it's understanding that people want them. The thing I find to be the biggest contradiction is this notion that people lose interest in watches that are readily available. This came up actually in the last survey, and it came up a few times in this survey as well, this notion that people just wished there were more, when it was possible, that there were more watches that were just readily available, that they didn't have to pre-order or, keep refreshing their browser at midnight to get, or have to deal with bundling or whatever it might be. There's just a feeling like, man, wouldn't it be great if for watches we can all agree should be in kind of regular production, regular availability, like they just were. And I think what's interesting, and we've seen this ourselves, is once a watch is readily available, like we see this as retailers, like people just lose interest in it. Mm-hmm. And this could be something that...
I don't know that I would say that categorically, but there's definitely less pressure on it.
Yeah. Like, there might be watches that we carry, right, that go out of stock for a while because of the way production runs work for some brands that we carry. And we'll get a flood of out of stock notifications, people, telling us like, hey, when this watch is back, let me know, or even calling us or emailing us or telling us like they are not only just interested in the thing or interested to know when it comes back, but they want it. And then guess what happens? When it's back in stock and it's available, they've lost interest. They moved on. And that could be for any number of reasons, but this was one of the things we found. I think one of the things I found most eye-opening as a retailer was I assumed initially when we got into this that when things went out of stock or weren't available, and this is true of limited edition pieces too, when they're sold out, and then people say, hey, if one's ever available pre-owned, let me know, or whatever it is. I assumed that that was pretty high signal. Like I assumed like, wow, this person says they want one. And most of the time, I'd say 9 times out of 10, when we approach someone who's expressed interest in a watch that was out of stock for whatever reason, they're completely uninterested.
Yep.
And now I've become used to that. Like, I know that's just a reality, but
it's part of retail.
It's part of retail. And I just sort of wonder like what it is, because in some cases we've gotten such strong appeals from people. Like, they have to have something. And then when it's available, like it turns out they were.
I think that there's a whole other conversation around retail psychology, which I would love to have on the pod, but let's wrap this up with the last 2 contradictions.
Right,
I said there were 3.
Box.
There are actually 4 because I was zoomed in on the doc. Okay. Hype.
Ooh. So how is this different than what we were just talking about?
Well, I'll tell you.
All right.
So some survey takers complain that brands fuel hype culture and that they make it difficult to buy their watches at retail prices because they want them to be perceived as exclusive. However, many of these same respondents still purchase and idolize those same brands.
So what are we talking about?
So in other words, this is somebody saying, I'll give you an exact example. I think that AP focuses so much. See, I didn't bring back the others. I think that AP focuses so much on building hype around their brand and creating a culture around their brand and making it so hard to buy their stuff that it drives me crazy. Also, I just bought a new AP.
So this is actual survey?
Correct.
Data?
This is actual survey
Some
data.
Respondent said these things.
I clearly I'm characterizing.
You're paraphrasing,
but
this was actually in the
correct.
Data. Okay.
And I mean, look, like I get it, right? Like if I've been trying to get a reservation at the hottest restaurant in town and I can't get it,
that's a really good metaphor.
And then like the hottest restaurant calls me up and says, there's a reservation tonight at 7. I'm probably going to go.
Yeah.
So like on the one hand, you can take the data and you can be like, ha ha ha, I got you on the hype thing. On the other side, here's another way to refer to this. This is effective marketing. Now, may not be marketing that the brand that the consumer likes, and that can backfire, because we saw that in the data too, where someone's like, the boutique experience sucks. I feel like I'm being treated poorly. I'm being vetted. Like, I don't want to be vetted. Like, all of this stuff, like, it's a double-edged sword. But I think part of the reason why these brands do this is because it works.
Yeah.
And, to a certain degree, that's just branding. Like, that's brand development. Where I think it starts to fall apart fundamentally is when a brand takes it to such a degree that the exclusivity isn't fun, it's alienating. And I do think that we're in that area with some folks, and figuring out how to back off that is challenging. But I also think it's important to sometimes take a look and say, like, I can't believe how hard this is, or like, I want this watch or that watch and I can't ever get it. And then they get a phone call and they're like, oh, here's my money, I'll take it. And it's like, it's just an interesting thing to look at oneself in the mirror and ask, because I know I would do that. This is not like me throwing shade at clients.
Yeah.
I would do that.
Yeah.
If there was a particular...
We've all done it in one aspect of our life.
Totally.
That's why I love the metaphor of the restaurant thing.
Yeah. So that's hype. And then finally, the last contradiction we saw was around design. So some folks criticize brands for lacking innovation. They said that too many of their watches are just reissues of past watches. I want something new and creative and interesting. I want the complete thought. But these same people also said, yeah, but the only watches I really buy are classic heritage-inspired designs. And I don't know, the overly modern experimental thing, it's not for me.
Well, this is exactly what we talked to Tim Jackson about when we did the episode about kind of the rise of independent watchmaking. And one of the things he pointed out was generally the most commercial indies are the ones that have the most sort of straightforward design.
Yeah. And I mean, this is, so if you
using classical watchmaking, and that's not to say like they're boring designs. I think, great example of a brand that manages to thread the needle on having obviously accessible and classical designs, but with their own idiosyncratic approach would be FP Journe.
Totally.
Like you look at it and it's clearly a watch, but you look at it and you know what I mean? It's not like an Urwerk, where someone would look at it and be like, what is that?
Yeah.
Which is what we love about it. But, you look at a Journe, you're like, it's a watch, but it obviously has the fingerprint of the maker in the design.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, what's the contradiction? People want innovation, so they say, but they also want timeless designs that don't stray too far from tradition. Here's an example of that. Watch sizes. So one other piece of data, which I didn't reference, but is in here, is that people constantly are saying, I want smaller watches. I want 37 to 39 millimeter watches. You know what watches don't sell very well? Watches under 39 millimeters.
Yeah. Oh, we've seen this time and time again. And there are...
And that, by the way, listen, the Project 21 from Ming was 35 millimeters, and that sold great.
34 millimeters, actually.
35.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but I think,
but
I think the point though is, sometimes there are things that we say, right, again, that don't necessarily reflect in our actions. And maybe that's because somebody looks at a smaller watch and they think it's really elegant, but then they put it on their wrist and it just doesn't play. And that's totally fine. But I just find it so fascinating when we see some of these things which, are proclaimed as trends, but in practice don't actually come out that way. So, look, life is full of contradictions. It's fun to look at how the data sometimes conflicts with itself. And I just also want to say this entire 1 hour conversation was based off of the 10 minutes, 20 minutes that each and every one of the 120 some odd respondents put in to do the work to submit this. So a gigantic thank you to our friends and clients that took the time to answer this. And we will continue to do the work of analyzing the data and sharing it out to you. This is so much fun. And I don't take it for granted. Some of these responses were paragraphs long. It required time and effort and thought. Very few responses were monosyllabic or phoned in.
Yeah, that's the thing that surprises me the most. And, in some cases, we've shared the number of respondents. We always share the number of respondents with, obviously on the podcast, with brands. And sometimes people are like, 129 people. That's not that many. But then I would challenge those folks to look at those verbatim responses.
Yep.
When you have 129 people who are willing to write tomes on this stuff and bless you and thank you for it, it's really, really, really meaningful feedback. And frankly, the verbatim feedback and the quotes that you guys share, are much more helpful than the numbers. The numbers are good because they obviously help ground us, and over time, we can see how things evolve. But it is the written feedback that provides the real insight and is super, super helpful. So like Asher said, thank you so much. We don't take it for granted that so many of you took the time to do this. We really greatly appreciate it.
Awesome.
Well, Asher, should we leave it there?
Let's leave it there.
All right. Well, thank you so much for listening. This, of course, is Open Work, a production of Collective Horology. You can find us online and learn more about our open house event at collectivehorology.com. We're also going to have a blog post with all the survey details at collectivehorology.com/blog. So if you want to dig into these numbers, they will be there. And if you'd like to get in touch with your suggestions, your feedback, or your questions, just email podcast@collectivehorology.com.